Hello and welcome to episode 60 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike, focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern and Pioneer. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the winner of GP Phoenix, Shane Beeps.
I didn't actually read how you're going to introduce me this week, and I'm just like, yeah, I definitely made it to day 2.
That bubble got a lot bigger, huh?
Yeah, I might have won. You just have to listen for the results later.
Also with us in Chicago, the Godfather, Dave Harburger.
You know, I made it day 2 too 5 years ago. It's not that big of a deal.
With a better record than I finished up with, honestly.
Just by one win. Just by one. But I have that tattooed on my knuckles.
One win better.
I've never day 2'd anything, so I look up to both of you.
Finally, it's taken 60 episodes.
We got there.
And now we have some big and sad news to bring you this week. You may have seen this on our Twitter as well as Zach's Twitter, but if not, our Red Mage, Zach Culhan, is no longer going to be our co-host on the Dive Down. With his increasing professional responsibilities at work and just life stuff in general, Zach was finding it more difficult to find a balance between his personal and professional life and the pod.
Yeah, this kind of sucks because Zach was truly instrumental in making the Dive Down what it's become, right? His sense of humor, his dedication to his play style, his positive outlook on people and the game of Magic is really second to none. And that's truly appreciated and not really easily replaceable at all. I think the podcast is definitely going to be a lot less goblin-y without Zach on it. We all really thank you. And I know the listeners in the Dive Down Nation, all thank you for all of your great work over the past year plus, Zach. Good luck.
I was just going to say, I think it's hard when things that you love kind of go through changes like this. And, you know, I think we just want everybody to know that those of us that are left are still going to do our best to carry on his legacy of the love and dedication to the Magic community. And, you know, still hope to interact with him at tournaments and things like that. I imagine we'll see him around on Twitter and other places like that as well.
But we will kick off today's show with a breakdown of the Regional Players Tour Phoenix, which I'm assuming Shane won. I haven't actually looked at the results. Then we dive into the format where it all began. It's Modern Week. We spent some time looking at post-ban Modern challenges and preliminary tournaments, coupled with our own experiences playing MTGO leagues, and we've woven a beautiful canvas depicting the state of today's Modern format. But first, some housekeeping. Greetings and salutations to the newest members to join the Dive Down Nation. Shoutouts this week go to Kyle P., Henry P., no relation, and Paul J. Also, Justin Takey.
Takey? You want to try that again? Justin TK, thank you so much for your support. We're keeping it all in, don't worry.
Also, thanks to Grizzleby and Rashidar for the kind reviews on Apple Podcasts. We're always appreciative of our fans. Thanks, everyone, for your ongoing support.
I was too committed to the rhyme. That's what happens.
Justin TK was one of my favorite rappers from the 90s.
If you'd like to support the show, you can check us out at patreon.com/thedivedown. You can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Heck, just tell your friends about us. We always love having new friends, new listeners. As always, you can support the show directly by supporting yourself with the Mana Trader subscription. You can use coupon code TheDiveDown, all one word, to get 15% off your first 3 months of renting Magic Online cards on manatraders.com.
And one thing I've noticed is that we can see the codes that people sign up with. So there's like a link, right? There's a link in our show notes, and it takes you to sign up. And then you can also put in the sign up code, right? So I've noticed, Nation, that some of you have put in the code Dive Down, not the Dive Down. So there might be some people out there that have used a non-functional sign up code, just Dive Down. So it's just always the Dive Down, all one word. Don't include the all one word part. I'm sure I'm confusing you more than I'm making anything clear. The dive down.
Shane's being coy, but we know who you are.
And we've set you up for some really interesting retargeting. So enjoy your ads because they're about to get blown up.
All right, with the housekeeping out of the way, let's jump over to our resident grinder, Shane Beeps, for this week's breakdown.
All right, so last week we talked about the regional players tour events in Europe and Asia Pacific. And the follow-up North American Regional Players Tour event in Phoenix took place over the last weekend. I was actually at the GP. I flew down with some other members of the Dive Down Nation. We had a good time, and it was just happening in one side of the room. It was a really nice branded area. I saw a lot of much better players than myself duking it out. It was really cool. About 355 players qualified to participate in the event. So there was 6 rounds of limited, 10 rounds of Pioneer constructed over Friday and Saturday, and then the top 8 takes place on the third day, Sunday. And so all the players here had the chance to respond to the previous weekend's metagame, right? So they all saw the results, they saw what happened, they got the same data we all did. I heard them talking about it on the podcast, I'm sure you listened to as well. They were all saying, what does this mean? How are people going to react? How are we going to react? And I think we were all really interested in how Phoenix might look a little bit different as a result of that. And so, as is really nice from Wizards lately in their Mythic Championship level and Pro Tour, Players Tour rather, still have a hard time with that, events, they release all the deck lists. We see all the pairings. We know everything that's happening. So we get a really good, while small, cross-section of what's happening. So the day one metagame looks like this. 20% Dimir Inverter, 13% Bant Spirits, 10% Red Aggro, 9% Lotus Breach, Sultide Delirium and Mono Black Aggro at 8%, 5% Mono White Heliod, 4% Sultai Inverter and Azorius Control, and then 22% was an other. And so it had stuff like Vampires, 5-colored Izzet, Izzet in Soul, Simic Ramp, and so on. So I have to admit, I'm a little bit surprised to see Bant Spirits so high and Sultide Delirium only at 8%. It seems like the kind of deck that a lot of Pro Tour level Players Tour level players would want to bring to the event to me.
I mean, I think that it's tough. I mean, you played in the GP this week.
Sure.
Did you feel like, Sultai Delirium is sort of like, do you believe in mid-range?
Yeah.
Right? Do you believe that that's really something that belongs in the format, is good in the format right now? And it really felt to me like going into it that people were very just into combo.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, Pioneer combo.
Yeah.
So I could definitely see the pros end up deciding that that was a dominated strategy because mid-range didn't have enough tools against combo and wasn't fast enough to beat it on its own.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? It's like if they know about Lotus Breach, if they know about Dimir Inverter, why bring the deck that has to kind of draw the right parts of its deck to pick apart their hand, to disrupt their strategy? So, yeah, we saw that happen, right? So they didn't really want to play fair decks. So 33% of the field was on some kind of inverter or a breach strategy, right? So these decks might have some ability to play fair while generating that combo finish, and I think that's more on the inverter side of things. But
yeah, breach literally does nothing other than
puts up a blocker in a Satyr Wayfinder or a Arboreal Grazer. Yeah. But yeah, by and large, so 33% of the room was on a combo finish potential. And that's a lot. There was definitely a lot of buzz, I think we were seeing about how broken Lotus Breach was. A lot of the CFB people were talking about it. It makes sense, right? It's super fast. It has a lot of ways to piece together those game-winning situations. The Lotus Breach deck does.
So my question here is, what happened with that deck in between last weekend and this weekend? Because it felt like that was the one that got the big boost in buzz and also the big boost in results, frankly, and people playing it. Going into the first PTs, I thought that Lotus Breach was going to be the thing that everybody ended up on in the first place.
Me too.
And then for it to come later, I guess, do people think that it beats Inverter, or what? Did you get an impression of what that was?
Yeah, it's like a turn faster, essentially, because Inverter doesn't interact incredibly well with it. I mean, I don't know what does. But Inverter runs the Thoughtseize, you know what I mean? So it's like if Inverter is running hand disruption, if they're running tools to even take out important pieces with like thought erasure, or what are the ones that kind of strip things from like their entire deck?
Lost Legacy and stuff like that.
Yeah. They have the ability to run those type of cards, and they do. But yet Lotus Breach is continually able to kind of go off, typically turn 3 or turn 4, I think. But Dimir Inverter kind of is usually like maybe turn 5-ish. So it's just like a step behind.
Yeah, I mean, it has no ramp, and it has no way to cheat out, a 4 CMC card into a 2 CMC or a 4 CMC card. So
yeah, exactly.
What's the matchup like between those two?
Well, I think Breach is usually faster, is what I was kind of trying to get at. I think Breach can, and you look at the results, as Breach is typically one of Dimir Inverter's only like sub 50% matchups. Like Dimir sort of hovers a lot around 50%. There's some that it's much better than 50%, of course, but Lotus Breach is like its only good matchup. We're kind of, skipping ahead a little bit, but that's not really where you want your combo decks to be, is one only being beaten by another.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the other decks that you had.
I think the fair decks in the room were kind of a few categories, and surprisingly kind of narrow categories. You had like your just aggressive decks like mono red. You had your disruptive aggressive decks like spirits or mono black. And then you had like your mid-range deck, the Sultai Delirium style deck, doing what they could to sort of disrupt the opponent and then generate so much value over the long game that they just destroy almost every aggressive strategy, because they just remove things. They play tons of 2-for-1s. They have Uro. So that's kind of just all you need.
I mean, Spell Queller can counter Inverter, which is maybe a little handy to buy yourself a turn back. So that's why you end up with spirits being around.
Sure.
Mono Black has some removal that can be used to kill Thassa's Oracle if they're not ready for that, and the trigger's on the stack in a bad way. So there's a little bit going on there that helps for sure.
Yeah, and Spirits lets you run blue, so you're able to play like Mystical Dispute, which is just a hugely important card right now.
Right. Mystical Dispute was the most played card I think I saw in the GP, if you included sideboards.
Yep. It was like 690 cards, out of all the decks. Pretty wild.
I'm sorry, in the PT, not the GP.
Yeah. Which means like an average of somewhere like three copies per deck.
Yeah.
Which seems like completely insane when I say that. No, 2 copies per deck. So that's just crazy. So let's briefly talk about day 2. As we said last week, it's because they do 3 rounds of draft and only 5 rounds of Pioneer on day 1. The day 2 conversion isn't entirely meaningful, but we saw some interesting trends begin to emerge. So Lotus Breach gained 6%, Dimir Inverter gained 4%, Sultai Delirium gained 3%, and then the sort of aggressive-y, disruptive decks like Banned Spirits, Mono Black, and Mono Red all lost 1% or 2% between day 1 and day 2. So the big gains of Lotus Breach and Dimir Inverter are definitely noticed, and everything else was somewhat flat. After day 1 was over, I saw that LSV was tweeting things like, Breach is obscene. There's going to be a lot of copies in the top 8. Just about everyone I know playing it has absurd records. And so let's see if his prediction rings true by talking about the top 8 for a second. So we had Corey Burkhart win the event with Dimir Inverter over William Huey Jensen on Lotus Breach. So Corey Burkhart is he just always does like Grixis control typically.
Yeah.
And so him winning with a Dimir control deck is not surprising to me. And then we saw Huey on the CFB team, I believe, on Lotus Breach, which they identified as a deck that they wanted to be playing. And so we saw the 2 big name combo decks in the field show up here in the finals with 2 really good pilots.
I mean, Poetic Justice, a terrifying twist in reality where all of a sudden we have combo decks facing off against each other again. I mean,
right after that, though, in the people who lost in the semis were Zachary Keeney on Mono Red. This is a faster version. It has 4 Rimrock Knights, 2 Zergo Bell Strikers, 4 Abbot of Carol Keeps. And this deck is looking to push damage pretty quickly. And Jacob Wilson, another excellent player, on Sultai Delirium. And so, right after we have these combo decks, we do see, an aggressive deck and then a fair mid-range deck right after there. So we're not in the dark space yet. And losing in the quarters, we saw Alan Wu on Lotus Breach, another like top tier player that you might not know their name. I think he's like leading the ELO project right now, like that sort of third party tracking thing that they look at, like what people's matchups are and things like that. So another excellent player. Austin Bursavich, also an amazing player on Azorius Control. Pete Ingram, another excellent player on Dimir Inverter, and Thomas Ashton, who made a Players Tour top 8, so they are also in my bucket of excellent players on Bant Spirits. So yeah, what do you guys think about this top 8?
I mean, going into it, if we expected those 2 decks, Inverter and Breach, to be the best decks in the format, and we only see 2 of each in the top 8, sounds to me like people knew how to beat it, how to play against it, and found out some decks that had an okay matchup.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the pros seem to have that work out, and specifically, it seemed like Bant Spirits did pretty well for the pros when maybe there was a little bit of like question of whether that was going to happen. I will point out that I know we're not going to talk much about the Grand Prix, but the Grand Prix had 5 Dimir Inverter decks in the top 8, along with 2 Bant Spirits and a mono red deck with the winner. So that metagame felt much more unbalanced than the Pro Tour did. The Players Tour did. I mean, this is of course, they're pros, but it's a great top 8, and I think it's really cool that Corey Burkhart finally got a win. I worry a little bit about what I've seen a few people mention right now, which is Pioneer being a format that doesn't have great interaction or cheap interaction all the time, falling prey to more combo decks that are fueled by new cards, specifically Thassa's Oracle. In both cases in this case. So that does worry me a little bit about the health of the metagame. People are banging the band drum already, and I guess we'll just kind of see what happens. But
the thing that is strange to me, and I'll talk a little bit about my GP experience. I played a slightly more aggressive red deck. I didn't play chonky red. It topped out at 3 Torbrins and a Chandra and a Hazaret. So there was still a significant number of 4-drops, but my plan was to try to beat up on these inverter decks, right? Like I was like, well, if I have the ability to play my prowess creatures, to get my Bone Crusher Giant down, get a Rabble Master down where they're not able to interact with it, and I just swing out and get them dead. And that is not the case. And so typically, like in Modern, we would say that like aggro beats combo, right? Because combo is not interacting well with what aggressive decks are trying to do, and they can just get them dead
right
before the combo really goes off. Is that something that you'd agree with?
Yeah, but I mean, it's clear, Inverter, like we talked about on last week's episode when I played it, Inverter has a ton of access to creature removal. And it has the best creature removal in the format, and Fatal Push and the chonky red decks in particular have cards that generally fall into the range of being pushable.
Yep.
And they also have Fabled Passage, so they can keep Fabled Passage up to be able to enable it as well. So, and then they also have Drown in the Lock and a couple other tools. So
yeah, so this is what I'm getting at, is that because the aggressive decks are less likely or have to be built in certain ways to get under decks like Dimir Inverter, I think that's kind of maybe the challenge that I see even more than sort of what's considered the interaction. Because I think the interaction exists on like sort of the creature removal end of things, and that's why Dimir Inverter is able to keep going. It has counter spells, it has creature removal like Fatal Push, like Drown in the Lock, and therefore it's able to just stop the aggression because it's all board based, because there's no such thing as like, you're not getting your 20 bolt deck.
Yeah.
I wish we had that 20 bolt deck.
It's called Burn in Modern. It's reasonably close. You can play some Shard Volleys and some other things and get there.
Lava Spike deck.
Yeah. So why don't we talk about the data a little bit, Shane? I know that you put a little bit of time into like looking around and seeing what the actual data was.
Yeah.
So you looked at Goldfish and MTGmeta.io, looked around the performance percentages. What did you find?
So there were 40 players that did 7-3 or better in the constructive. So if you look just at the constructive performance, don't look at it at the limited environment at all, we can see kind of what the best performing decks in the room were. And this is where stuff got pretty eye-opening to me. 33% of those 40 decks were Lotus Breach. 25% of those decks were Dimir Inverter.
So just to be clear, 33% of 40 is 13.
Yeah.
Or 14, right? And then 25% is 10.
Yeah. So 58% of the decks that performed well, I think there was a Sultai Inverter in there as well, kind of in the other bucket.
Sure.
So I think that's something like 60% were combo finish decks. And then we had 7.5% were things like Sultai Delirium, 7.5 Bant Spirit, 7.5 Azorius Control, 5% mono red, mono black, and 10% other. So 40 people, 60% combo were the 7/3 or better decks. Kind of a bad look.
So 24 of the 40 people were on combo. The other 16 were on.
Yeah, so if you wanted to play a good deck this weekend, more likely than not, you were running Lotus Breach or Dimir Inverter. And so this is backed up by the data we have about just the raw win rates of the players who were on those decks. Lotus Breach, 64%. Dimir Inverter, 55%. And then Sultai Delirium and Azorius Control were also both at like 55, 56%. So those are pretty good win rates. I mean, it was a player store environment. It was a regional player store environment. So there's still all really good players, but you do have some of the best players in the world in the room who can capitalize on their skill. But 64%, that's a big win rate. That's eye-opening.
It's terrifying, is what it is.
Yeah, those are the only 4 decks with a 50% win rate or higher at the player store.
So everything else was sub 50?
Yes.
Just because the sample was there were so many people on Breach and Inverter, basically.
Yeah, Sultai Delirium, Azorius Control, Dimir Inverter, Lotus Breach. And then decks like Mono White Heliod, Mono Black Aggro, Mono Red, and even Bant Spirits and Sultai Inverter were below 50%. I think like Bant Spirits and Mono Red were right around 50, but still, it's not necessarily where you want to be. I mean, again, sample size type stuff, so take it with a slight grain of salt, but we're seeing some trends develop over time. We have these 3 tournaments now. We have the 3 players, regional player stores, and we can see these trends like the combo decks of Lotus Breach and Dimir Inverter are really good. Like Lotus Breach has a 60% win rate over 356 matches. And Dimir Inverter, which has a much larger sample size, over twice as many as 891 matches, is 56%. We don't see a lot of decks at 56% over a long period of time.
Survive.
Yeah.
Is the word you were going to add to that sentence.
Survive can mean a number of things, right? Like Grixis Death Shadow never ate a ban.
Right.
And so the metagame responded, right? And even the fair deck in Sultai Delirium is performing really strongly. It's got a 59% win rate. The sample size of matches is 247. And you have people like Yoel Larson and Reed Duke playing the deck in a tournament. You're going to see good matches. But when we see decks with 50% high 50% win rates, the metagame adjusts or Wizards adjusts. And we'll have to see what happens in the near future. Like, how are people going to be attacking this? Or is Wizards going to attack?
I guess the thing that's the biggest surprise to me is that Azorius Control was pretty high on that list still. And so as someone who looks at this list of cards and goes, well, I kind of have Dimir Inverter as a deck in my arsenal, but I'm probably going to go to Control, I guess. I don't know. When you played in the Grand Prix, did it feel like you were behind these decks when you ran into them with one of the 50% decks? Did the people that you were talking to feel that way? In
terms of, like, you mean Blue-White Control, or in terms of the other ones? Oh, yeah.
No, I mean the other ones. Like, did you run into a lot of Lotus Breach in the Grand Prix as well?
I played 3 flavors of Inverter. I played against the blue splashing black Devotion style, which I don't think is particularly good build of the deck.
But you do get to flash in Inverter is part of why people play it, right? Because they play Leyline of Anticipation.
Yes. And just, there's more blockers. So I was able to win that one, but I definitely did not feel, even with my hyper aggressive draws that I mulled to, like I had, a really incredible 6 versus like my opponent at 4, right? And they still won just fine. And it's because if they have a single removal spell for your Goblin Rebel Master that you're leaning on, and like you're like, I need this Rebel Master to be unchecked for 2 turns. That's a lot to ask.
Yeah, that is a lot to ask.
Yeah, I think that the Inverter is surprisingly good against the aggressive decks, because like I said before, it has removal. And it's even smart for them to like leave in Thought Seizes, because they can like I played against Jonathan Rossum on Inverter, and game 3 he Thought Seizes me, and I was like, oh well, that's gutsy, but I think it's smart. Like I can generate a lot more than 2 damage out of some of my cards. So you pick out something in my curve, you pick out an early curve piece for you have removal for something later. It's just it's smart to do, because the deck has a much more solid inevitability than like a blue-white control deck does in Pioneer.
Yeah, you didn't feel like we're going to see that post sideboard, huh?
I mean, it didn't really come into play, because it was like I couldn't keep. There was no hand I could keep that was like more Thoughtseize proof than it, essentially.
Shane, so if you're saying that either the metagame has to adapt or Wizards has to adapt, let's start with that first bucket. What do you think the metagame or the Pioneer card pool has that could start attacking, one of these 2 decks, if not both?
Well, I mean, these decks really don't operate very well without their graveyard. I think that we could see stronger graveyard hate than things like Tormod's Crypt. I think that's why being able to run Rest of Peace is good. Being able to run Leyline of the Void is good. I think more honestly, Damping Sphere is really strong against Lotus Breach. They have to be able to, maybe tutor up spells that can bounce it. They do have Granted off of the Fae of Wishes that probably could.
Yeah, they get blink of an eye quite often, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways for them to deal with it, but it can buy you time. I think aggressive decks, and like I said, aggressive decks do offer more of a threat against Lotus Breach than they do against Dimir Inverter. So that particular combination is probably pretty decent, because they can't go off until they get to the ability to remove your Damping Sphere. I don't really know, Stan, honestly. Like, I think that we've seen some tech in the builds of like the Sultai Delirium deck, like the Brain Maggots tech. That is that Brain Maggot? Is that what it's called from Theros?
Yeah.
So what you can do, like, you can traverse for it after they Inverter, and then get the other piece and exile it.
Right.
And they don't really have the ability to potentially remove the Brain Maggot on the field. So it keeps the card exile, those deck themselves. So it's like there's a lot of like fun things you can, I think, do in toolbox decks like that. I think Banned Spirits can probably keep learning how to play the matchup better too, potentially. It's like, I don't know, man. I'm not expert in playing all these decks against all these other decks, but I have hope.
Excuse me, you just made the day 2 of a Grand Prix.
That's a lot of coin flips going my way, Dave. I mean there's like 3 times I can point to doing something where I was like, I made the right decision. And I really felt like I played really well. I mean, like, so let me talk a little bit about that. You want me to do that to the listening ears of the nation?
I know that people in the nation want to hear about it. I know that Stan and I would love to hear a little bit about what your GP run was like. We might as well put it right here.
Sure. So like, let's keep it under 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Okay. So I went to the GP. I brought in slightly aggressive mono red. I lost my first match.
Who did you hang out with at the GP though? It's all about the gathering. It's not about the magic.
Honestly, that was a really good part. We had a really good crew. I went down with Spencer, he plays at the store that I play at most often, which is not that often, but we do see each other there. And he's an awesome dude. He brought a friend of his who I guess manages a game store up north of Denver. So he had a lot of inside information for, he knew a lot more card names than I did. Let's just say that. And we met up with Dom from the Bay Area. Dom, awesome dude. Mickey, he's a Phoenix local who we actually started. He found the dive down through Todd Anderson's Twitch stream. He saw me say I was going to go to the GP, and he joined the nation. So shout out to Mickey. And also Max was there. He is somewhat local. He had and we hung out with him too, and that was awesome. We all 3 of us played the main event. 4 of us, I think, and the 2 guys just did side events, and the GP experience overall was really awesome. I will give a lot of props to Channel Fireball. They ran a great event. It was open. It was clean. There were awesome judges everywhere. Everything made sense. Signage was good. Vendors were good. It was the weather was awesome. They controlled that. I thank them for the really nice weather. So that was a cool part. We did some side events on Friday, practiced a little bit on Friday night, and woke up fresh and ready to attack the day, which I promptly lost my first match against a Sultai mid-range deck, which is a 80-20 matchup maybe against Mono Red. It's incredibly good. And I was like, well, this might be a fast day, and proceeded to sort of win and basically win out. I won the next 6. I was at 5-1, and I was like, well, I need to win one of the next 2. I played against a really good player, a player whose name is known for my winning in at 6-1, and we had in a really good game. And I was this is definitely like one of those things where, like, when did you feel like you leveled up? And it was this game where I was against blue-white control, and I had a game plan against it and executed the game plan and was able to win. And that felt really cool. Like, that was just a neat thing to make my first day 2 off the back of beating someone who I've known for years as a much better player than me and is still a much better player than me. One match doesn't change that.
And you're not going to name this person?
I mean, that seems rude. You know who they are.
Fair.
But more importantly, all my matches were awesome. Like, people were really, really chill. Everyone was there to have a good time. We were chit-chatting, where are you from? How are you enjoying Phoenix? Like, how are you enjoying the GP? No one was, I think you go to these things expecting people to be kind of angle shooting. You kind of worry about playing that player who's like, yeah, but honestly, I think that's the exception. That is not the rule.
It very much is. I think people need to relax a little bit when I mean, there are people out there who are trying to angle shoot and are jerks about stuff, but for the most part, everybody's really cool. Quite often at the events I've gone to. So
yeah, it was really good event. And going into day 2 was a little bit anxiety inducing.
At the GP that you and I were at when I day 2'd, I had a similar start. I started out 1-2,
yeah,
and then had to win out to do it, and it happened.
And then you won out. Yeah, that was awesome. And we couldn't have fun in Vegas.
Yep. And similarly, I know that you had trouble sleeping.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
I also had trouble sleeping before it, because you're just kind of like, what is this going to be like? I can't believe it happened.
Well, whenever I'm, coming off of a big Magic event, whether or not I win or lose, I have trouble sleeping just because, I'm playing games in my brain against my will, and I'm dreaming of, triggers.
Yep. Yeah, I think just thinking about scenarios that you're going to find yourselves in. What are you going to do in matchups? Am I going to change my sideboarding type thing? Like, what happened today that, I need to change for tomorrow? That kind of thing.
Did you have a sideboard guide with you? Did you have notes?
Yeah, I wrote one out, and then I changed it a little bit. Like, after day 1, I was like, oh, I really should have Lava Coil in against Inverter in case they bring in Kalidas against me, type thing. So
yeah,
and it also tags. It also exiles the Thassa's Oracle, so do it.
You can change your sideboard between days 1 and 2, or just your sideboard plan?
No, I just changed my plan. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, you cannot do that. That would be illegal. Well, if it would be legal, it would be disqualification. So
all right. So day 1, you're grinding it out. When did you start to kind of get to a point where you were like, I feel like this is kind of happening a little bit? Like, did you get to 3-1 and go, maybe I'm starting to put together a run, or
no?
Okay,
5-1, 5-1. Because then it was like, I just got to win one of the next 2.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the pragmatic way to be, right? To just like keep it calm and be like, anything can happen. I mean, I'm sure lots of us have started tournaments 3-1 before and been like, you know,
yeah, I can the train can always go off the track here.
Yeah,
and so often it does.
The thing that I am actually most happy about is I have been in situations where I have been winning, and then I just get really anxious. I mess up. I'm starting to play badly. I'm overthinking things or underthinking things. And I was really even keel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you pause a tilt.
Yeah, pause a tilt.
I have a tendency to do that too. Is like I don't tilt that bad from losing, but I can tilt pretty hard from winning a couple of times when I felt like I didn't deserve it, or I felt like I played really well. And then all of a sudden I just loosen up my range, and it's like, yeah, it's bad.
Yeah, so that was what I was actually most proud of, was just keeping to my game plan, knowing what my plan is against certain decks, mulliganing to that game plan, not keeping looser hands. The deck cooperated extremely well, but you're not going to win Magic if your deck's not cooperating very much anyway. At least I'm not. So it was just a confluence of factors, and that helped a lot. And so I went into, so you play the 9th round on day 1. So you basically make day 2 after round 8, and then you play the first round so that they can finish up things in good time on the second day. And so I forget even if I won or lost that one. But anyway, did I win?
I believe you won, didn't you? Didn't you go into?
Yeah. I went in at 7-1 or 7-2.
7-2.
Yeah, I went in at 7-2. Yeah, so that felt good. Going in at 7-2 felt awesome. Day 2, I didn't perform quite as well. I don't think thankfully it's not due to any big mistakes, I don't think. So that felt good. Like my biggest mistake was day 1, and that was just forgetting some triggers that actually would have won me the match. But let's forget about that. But day 2, I didn't feel like I made many mistakes. It just, the deck performed a little bit less well. I probably made mistakes I don't even know that I made. I'm certain that happened. I played better players. I played better decks. I played slightly worse matchups, and that's what happened. But so I finished at 9-6. Thankfully, the last round, my opponent and I were both in position. If we won, we would cash. So we decided just say, let's split. And no matter what happens, we trust each other to just, send the money when we get it type thing. So I ended up losing that match. So thanks to my opponent for being chill. I'm sure eventually I'll see my half of the, $250 prize. And it was fun. I could say I cashed a GP technically, not by my record, but by just getting into a position where I could split. And honestly, it was some of the most fun Magic I've had in a long time because everyone was very cool to play against.
So I'm going to ask you the same question that my wife asked me after my day 2, which was, do you feel like you're good now? And you feel like you've kind of proven yourself? Not good as in a good player, but good as in some of the competitive edge is satiated? Or do you think that all of a sudden you've unlocked a fire and you're like, I'm getting on a plane to the next Pioneer GP?
Well, that's a good question, Dave. I really do think Pioneer is an incredible format. Mono red in Pioneer is so much different than mono red in Modern.
It's absurdly different.
It's so much about the board status and thinking about how to generate positions you can win from, and that felt really cool to identify and execute those. A lot more than kind of living off the top of my deck, like I feel I do in Modern Burn sometimes. I mean, you still live off the top of your deck. It's Magic, right? But it felt like I had to maneuver myself into a way to turn the corner, to push damage through, and that was really cool. I think that it was a lot of fun. I definitely will play any Pioneer GP that's in the future. I mean, I think that the next one we'll probably get to is like Vegas, and I'm sure there's going to be some kind of Pioneer stuff there. But yeah, it's one of those things where it makes me feel like, yeah, I could win a PPTQ. Do you know what I mean? Like, or a PTQ. I could go to an event and hold my own against players, understand the metagame, I know my role and things like that. So,
and you're talking about Pioneer specifically now.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, as your friend and observer, you've just been putting in the work into Pioneer, testing lots of different decks, watching the format evolve over time.
Yeah, mainly in preparation for this. Do you know what I mean? Like I knew I was going to this event for months, and so I wanted to be prepared for it. I'm definitely going to take a break from Pioneer mentally for a few weeks. I'm going to check out. I want to play some Modern. Everyone else was playing a lot of Modern that we were hanging out with, and so that was something I was like, man, this looks fun. Like they're playing that playing the new Dredge deck. They're playing the Yawgmoth deck. One of our guys was playing Jund because he's just a Bleen BGX player, dyed it in wool. So everyone's playing what they want and having some fun. I saw people playing Tron. I was like, I haven't seen those cards in a long time.
We're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes.
A long time. Yeah, I think I've talked enough. So thanks for giving me a little bit of a platform to talk about. I think much more than my performance. I think the performance of everyone else at the event was what's truly awesome. Everyone was very cool. CFP was very cool. The Dive Down Nation was very cool. And it made me really appreciate that Magic is still a community I'm very happy to be a part of.
Shane, I'm so happy to hear that you had a rewarding weekend. What's next?
Well, Stan, I think we're going to take a quick break. And when we return, we'll dive into our analysis of today's modern meta. Stay with us.
If you've been playing Modern for at least a couple months, or at least listening to our show for that long, you'll probably recall the format-shaking bans that were announced on Monday, January 13th, when Mox Opal, Oko Thief of Crowns, and Microsoft Lattice were banned out of the format.
Black Monday, they called it. For some people.
I was driving through London at the time. I'll never forget where I was when Microsoft Lattice was banned.
Is it Blue Monday, maybe? So these three cards, in their own way, had shaped the nature of Modern's meta for a long time, right? Maybe, or in the case of Oko, not that long, but certainly had done a lot of damage. And since their ban and the introduction of Theros Beyond Death, the format's been shifting towards a new metagame. So we wanted to take a look at that. And so we decided to pour over a bunch of data and try to bring forth an assessment of where Modern is going right now.
And that's exactly what it did. We made some spreadsheets, turned them into pivot tables, organized them with filters, and voila, created a meta snapshot and tier list of post-ban Modern.
Guys, we really should have planned this episode better if I was going to talk about data for that long. This is like Data, the episode.
This is like the sequel to our math episode.
But he's my favorite character on TNG anyway, so.
I heard there's some weird stuff with him and Picard. You guys watching Picard? Is that a thing?
I've heard it's weird too. I kind of want to see
I'm not going to subscribe to CBS All Access though. Sorry, CBS. I know you're a sponsor.
I got some websites for you to check out, Dave.
And based on the data from the last 4 Modern challenges, as well as 15 Modern preliminaries, we'll share some of our empirical findings, some anecdotal observations, and reflect on how Modern feels today compared to last year.
So, since Shane loves data and loves disclaimers, the one thing that we wanted to point out really quickly here is that our data is essentially based off of win counts, raw win counts of different decks, different archetypes, and things like that across these events. So, we have no way of knowing if the frequency of the wins, how much of that's related to performance versus how much of that is related to portion of entry metagame, let's say, like, you know, the equivalent of kind of a day one meta in a Grand Prix kind of idea. But
so you're saying we don't know the conversion rates, Dave?
Correct. Yeah, we don't know the conversion rates here. Like, we don't know how many people entered a given Modern challenge with Titan Shift. We just know how many showed up in the top 32 and what their final win totals were. But I still think there's a lot to learn from that, and definitely gives us a sense of what the meta looks like and what the top end of the meta looks like in general as well.
So in general, some of the questions that we're going to try to answer as we look through these tournaments include: what are the most popular and most successful archetypes in Modern after the bans? We'll try to consider what makes these decks so good right now, as well as archetypes that are being unrepresented, either for the first time in a while or just at least in this moment.
And I think at the end, we're probably all going to give an impression of what we're going to do now in Modern as a result of kind of reading through and pouring through this data as the players that we are.
Right, because it's definitely going to inform our choices about what we take to the Dice Dojo.
That's right. Or what I put in my next league.
So let's start with the Modern challenges. Since these are bigger Magic tournaments, they happen weekly on Saturdays. And it's not uncommon for these events to have as many players as a GP, especially a contemporary GP. The minimum number of players for a challenge is 8, but it can top out at 672.
Give me that 8-person challenge, please.
Some of the prelims were having a hard time firing, and at one point in time, they were having a hard time even getting 24 people, things like that.
I remember that.
In these modern challenges, you play typical Swiss-style rounds based on attendance. So more players equals more rounds in the tournament. And then after that, there's a cut to top 8. They actually cost about $25 to play. And if you do really well, it can take a whole day to complete. So because of this, it tends to attract an upper echelon of MTGO players. For purposes of this episode, we will only be looking at decks that got into the top 32 of these tournaments, which typically means that the decks had gone 4x or better. So in other words, they had an over 50% win rate. And by looking at this data, we hope to not only get an idea of what's popular in high-level modern play these days, but additionally, what is producing results at high-level modern play in this, the year of our Lord, 2020.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out really quickly is that we're going to spend some time looking at challenges, and we're going to spend some time looking at prelims. We're looking at them separately from each other because they're different style events, right? The challenges, like Stan just explained, are essentially Swiss tournaments. They have a top 8. The prelims are leagues. We get data from both of them, right? But we wanted to keep them separate because the challenges are more rounds, and they're also the Swiss style play instead of the league style play.
Yeah, the advent of the prelims is one of my favorite things in terms of data quality that we've got from Wizards in a long time, because we're able to see what decks are winning in a closed environment rather than what's just 5-0ing in the larger league.
We can see the increased frequency is the thing of if multiple decks are doing well of the same type, we get to see that happening. So without any more ado or caveats or worrying about whether you're going to nail us to some kind of data problems in Reddit, here are our observations from the most recent 4 modern challenges.
So let's start with looking at what we can say empirically are among the best decks and what are potentially the 6 best decks based on total match wins across these 5 tournaments. In first place, by a hair, Amulet Titan. 57 match wins across 5 tournaments. And this is across all pilots who brought Amulet Titan decks to modern challenges.
Mm-hmm.
In second place, Jund, 55 match wins, followed by Eldrazi Tron with 50, Mono Red Blitz, or as I call it, Mono Red Prowess, 47 match wins across these tournaments, Titan Field decks, 37, and Dredge, 32.
So, great numbers, but I think there's a little bit of something that we need to do here to reduce things down a bit. So the only thing I'd like to do here is potentially move to consolidate Titan Field and Amulet Titan into a bigger bucket that just says Titan decks.
Yeah. Because
then it goes from being a whisker of a lead to being a total domination as far as the amount of wins for these decks overall. Because if you consolidate Amulet Titan and Titan Field, you get 94.
Yeah. Woof.
With the second place being Jund at 55. And that is a big difference. I don't know. I'm not a math person, but.
So the next metric that we've got bucketed are decks that appeared at least 5 times in these post-ban modern challenges. So for here, I'll apply Dave's suggestion, combine Amulet Titan and Titan Field, and we saw this bucket of deck appear 19 times across these 4 tournaments for first place.
Right, so that's 19 out of 128 decks, as we're pointing out. So it's just shy of, 1/6 of the top 32 metagame across all of these.
Right, and in second place is Jund with only 12. And as we move down the line, we start to see a lot more, closer numbers in terms of this representation, but Primeval Titan still clearly takes the cake for representation.
Yeah, I gotta say, as someone who's been honestly a little bit on the sidelines for Modern the past few weeks, focusing on Pioneer in preparation for my stuff, is the people are right about Titan, clearly. I'm surprised by Jund, and I'm honestly surprised to see no Urza strategies that I can tell. I thought that it would still be around.
Yep. And we have some more notes on this a little bit later, but Urza, as far as the way that it goes, was the 10th most popular super archetype in the challenges. So that's why it didn't make our list. There were only 22 of those grand total in these 4 challenges in the top 32s.
Mm-hmm.
22 wins by those decks. Sorry, not 22 decks, but that deck only got 22 wins overall.
The next most popular deck, Mono Red Prowess, appeared 10 times, Eldrazi Tron 9 times, Dredge 7 times, and 4-color Death Shadow appeared 6 times. And in fact, as a small caveat to the previous list about overall match wins, after Dredge, the next most successful deck was 4-color Death Shadow, which had 28 wins across these 4 challenges.
Yep. And I think what I'd love to do is stop here for a second and talk about, because I just hinted to it a second ago, like the super archetype idea, because it does change the picture of the metagame a little bit. So we talked about Titan being at the top of that heap already. So what I mean by super archetypes is like these different decks like Amulet Titan, Titan Field, and even other decks that run Titan kind of all laddering up into one deck, right? And so that was the top with 109 wins. But the second place list with wins was a bucket that I kind of broadly categorized as just combo, which is made up essentially of things like Ad Nauseam and Storm and that kind of combo deck.
Jeskai Ascendancy.
Jeskai Ascendancy was in there as well. There was 69 wins from those decks. And so it's been showing up a lot as well.
Nice.
And other than that, Tron vaults ahead if you count mono green Tron with it. Mid-range, kind of if you bolster it a little bit, it comes in 4th by adding in things like Mardu Pyromancer and other decks that are really in kind of the mid-range sense. So that's kind of where things sort of stop coming out of changing the order that you talked about earlier. The only one I wanted to mention finally was that if you count Grixis Death Shadow and 4-color Death Shadow together as a single bucket, that does become the deck with the 5th most wins with 48.
And in the past, we and other sort of data collection, data analysis type people, you can even call those type of decks like Thoughtseize decks, like Jund and Death Shadow decks get a lot of value from the Thoughtseize and removal disruption, and then having a clock at the end to more or less effectiveness.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that I've had to reappraise what I think the Death Shadow decks are in the last couple of weeks, especially after talking to Michael Rapp last week. And so check out the bonus episode if you haven't listened to it yet. We have a long discussion about where the different kind of shadow builds fit within the metagame and what types of decks they really are. But one thing he does say is that Grixis and Jund Death Shadow and 4-color Death Shadow are all kind of in the tempo to aggro continuum. And so I have to reappraise what I've said in the past, where I've kind of been like, all these Thoughtseize decks are just mid-range decks. I've had to really think about that as I've been playing that deck recently, and also after talking with him about it, that I think they are much more in the kind of aggressive-y or tempo camp, depending on which flavor you're playing.
Let's pepper this conversation really quick with just a look at the winners. Only 4 tournaments. There are 4 winners, and maybe there's something interesting there. On January 18th, the winner of the Modern Challenge was Blue-White Control. On the 25th, Amulet Titan. On February 1st, Jeskai Ascendancy. And on February 8th, Eldrazi Tron. So, to me, this kind of goes to show that the most popular decks aren't always the ones that are winning the tournaments. They may give you the best shot at winning the tournament, but if you're a Blue-White master, still probably playable.
Yeah, Blue-White Control was close to the top of ours too, or sorry, Control in general, if you factor in other control builds with it. So blue-based Control like Blue-White and Blue-Red, Stan, was definitely an archetype that was appearing higher in there. So I'm not too surprised to see that win one of the challenges, especially early on, the first one right after the bans. And then seeing the Titan take one makes a ton of sense. Seeing Eldrazi Tron take one makes a ton of sense. Ascendancy is the deck that, of course, is kind of an outlier, but it does seem like combo is good, like I said. And so if you're someone who loves to play these kind of like one-off combo decks, it's probably a reasonable time to try to play them.
We're going to pivot to the Modern Prelims now, but we will return to this data in more broad strokes a little bit later as we share some of our insights and takeaways about the format at large. But
how different could the prelims be?
Well, let's find out, Dave. Take us through it.
So like we said, the prelims are a relatively new addition to Magic Online. They are daily-ish events. You can get qualifier points by doing well in them that let you enter PTQs. So this is part of the PTQ system. The reason that they've taken on a significance, like Shane mentioned earlier, is that Wizards has decided to release all the data from these for us to be able to look at. And so given that they're reasonably high level play with reasonable stakes, players that want to get in the PTQ system mostly have to play these events to get QPs. You do get like a serious level of people playing these cards. There were 15 events that we looked at and put together a pivot table for. And by the way, I think that we should post up a version of this in our show notes that'll let people in the nation have a look at the data that we pulled together.
Yeah. What I love about these prelims is it's like going to your LGS and playing a 5-round event where your end boss is Gabe Nassif and Todd Anderson.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the beauty about Magic Online in general, right? Is like following someone on Twitter and thinking that they're really cool. And then all of a sudden you look up and you're playing LSV in a league and you're like, wait,
the LSV?
What have I done?
Yeah. He doesn't like my screen name because my screen name is LSV Sucks.
It was you.
Have you seen that? I mean, if you haven't seen his header image is him playing against someone named LSV Sucks, which is funny. That's not me.
It's like the conversation is like, this is awkward.
I like LSV a lot, but so I wouldn't. Mine would be LSV Rocks
with 2 X's.
Yeah. So anyway, they're 5-round events, like Shane said, and Magic Online publishes all the decks that go 3-2 and better in these prelims. So we published these together, pulled them together into spreadsheets, and took a look at the way that the meta emerged on these. And here's what we have. If you look at the individual deck archetypes, the top 5 decks for overall match wins were Mono Red Prowess with 95 wins out of the 15 events that we looked at, followed by Bant Snowblade with 58, Amulet Titan with 50, Dredge with 48, and Jund with 44.
Already really noticeable shifts from the modern challenge meta.
Yeah, very much.
And it's interesting to me since you think there's a lot of overlap in the player base. And this mono red result at the top, without going into too much detail, doesn't surprise me at all because these preliminary posts happen so frequently that they all kind of blend together in my brain. But, I scan them almost every day, and I feel like without fail, there's always at least one mono red prowess deck in those lists. Sometimes it went 3-2, sometimes it wins, but they're always there.
And I think that something to note is that since this is a league style event, you can fire up Prowess and just blast through a league and try to get your QPs. I haven't had time to play one of these yet because they do have kind of like defined times that they start, from what I understand. So it feels like they're never quite lining up with when I actually get to play. But so those raw deck counts, I think, change just a little bit if you look at the super archetypes that we were talking about earlier, because Titan rockets up to being the top of the list again with 124 wins. If you do this, Prowess / Mono Red Blitz or whatever. I don't know why people call it Mono Red Blitz suddenly, but it is.
All of a sudden it's a Blitz deck, I guess.
It is the Prowess deck. Prowess stays the same because there's really only one deck within that archetype. Tron decks move up into third place with 79 wins. And you can have some debate over how close Green Tron is to Eldrazi Tron is to Dice Station, which is another deck that runs the Tron lands. But if you kind of lump all those Tron running lands together into a single deck, you get 80. Mid-range, you get 79. Combo, you get 79. And Stoneforge Mystic, if you look at that as an overall archetype, you get 71.
Really surprised that Stoneforge Mystic decks do so much better here than they do in the modern challenges. But
yeah, where do they come from?
More on that later.
Ooh.
We're going to talk about that in a minute when we do a breakdown of deck by deck, because I think that what we want to do is kind of look at each one of these archetypes and see kind of what's going on with them, why we think they're improving, why we think they're on the
elevator going up.
Yes, exactly. But the last thing we wanted to do for the picture, just with the prelims, one of the last things is talk about how many of these decks went 5-0 as far as across these 15 prelims go. So we have two things to look at last here. One of them is just a raw count of what decks have won the most prelims or 5-0'd the most times. And it turns out that the number one deck on this list is Mono Red Prowess with 3 5-0s, followed by Dredge, Dimir Urza, Azorius Control, and Amulet Titan, all with 2 5-0s.
Right. And looking at the popularity within the format, there's actually a pretty clean cut of decks that appeared in the prelim list at least 10 times. So they may have gone 3-2, they may have gone 4-1. Mono Red Blitz, single most popular deck, 27 prelim appearances. Bant Stoneblade, 17. Amulet Titan, 15. Jund and Dredge both appeared 13 times. And Titanfield appeared 12 times. So it's almost a mirror image to the top 5 decks for overall match wins with some adjustment. But Bant Snowblade, what an outlier.
Why don't we start with Bant Snowblade? So now we're going to go through and give our impressions about the individual decks that we've seen. Like I said, what's going up, what's going down. Bant Snowblade is super interesting because, I mean, I love that this deck is still out there and it's maybe considering worth picking up again. You know, it got a pretty big shot in the arm from Oko, and so I think a lot of ways I was surprised to see that it was still here without it. But I do think it's worth noting that the player with the most wins among everyone in these prelim events, which we also counted based on everything, is McWinsauce, who is a well-known blue-white control player, also, of course, plays Stoneforge and was playing Bant Control for a while during the Oko days. They have the most wins.
Yeah, exactly.
And on all the events, they registered playing Bant Snowblade. So in some ways, there's certainly a few other players who were playing it as well. But a huge part of that is that McWinsauce is in here just doing well with the deck on their own. And so the question becomes, could I really pick it up? I mean, I'm not sure.
I'm skeptical, Dave. Not to belittle your skill as a player, but, you know, we see this with some other examples, especially on MTGO grinders. When someone kind of focuses in on a deck, they will sometimes be the trophy leader in leagues. And I think they can really come to these tournaments and almost farm tickets. So we know what McWinsaw's decks are, right? It's not like they're using some kind of super novel technology that's always skirting the meta. I think at the end of the day, they're just great with this deck. They know how to play against the meta in these tournament styles. They probably have their own assessment about what's their good and bad matchups and what are their likelihood and plan to play against them. So I don't know. What this tells me is that, sure, the deck is fine, but maybe this is one of those decks that anyone can play, but few can master.
Yeah, especially in this meta, right? And this is a more controlling build too. Looks like the lists that they played have tended to include Jace the Mind Sculptor, and so that's a pretty largest deck, right? Like you're controlling if you're going to have that around. So it's almost like a blue-white control that splashes green for some value-y elements like Ice Fang Coatl and stuff like that.
Noble Hierarch.
So we'll just cross that one off the list, but I think now we should kind of go through by meta size, or what we expect the meta size in Modern to be right now. So let's start at the top of the list. Let's talk about Titan. Titan is the top of the meta game, and it's really not close. I think if you look at all of these events that we looked at, like we said, we looked at 19 events. It's pretty clear that across all of those, Titan is doing the best as a super archetype, and it just depends on what flavor of Titan you want to play.
You know, I'm old enough to remember when Amulet Titan was a very hard deck to play, and it was kind of on the fringes of Modern. I think this is back in the day when we did one of our earliest deck dives, when our show was pretty new, and I'd run it through a few leagues. And like, when did everyone learn how to play this deck?
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who, like you said, I think it's an easier deck to play now than it was a few months ago, and some of that is because you have redundant pieces for things now. You know, I don't have an impression if Dryad of the Elysian Field is in every single Amulet Titan deck now or not, but it is in every Titan Shift deck, and you know, it kind of going from there. There's just other tools that are helping with consistency, like Once Upon a Time and things like that.
Yeah, you also have this new inevitability engine in the form of Field of the Dead, which so many Titan decks have adopted as a way to, like, if I'm not playing amulet builds that just kind of combo in out of nowhere, I'll eventually set up a board state that you can almost never get through.
Yeah. So none of us play Titan.
No.
What do we think about this being the top deck in the meta right now?
Effectively, it acts like some kind of combo deck, right? I mean, that's kind of what Modern does in general. A lot of Modern sort of feels like different types of combo decks, but it feels like one of those decks that just generates so much power off of its cards, and it's so consistent at getting the cards that it wants that it feels like a deck that, you know, there are certain lines that happen a lot. There are the occasional lines that happen less frequently that the better players can identify more easily. But I think that it seems like it's a somewhat straightforward, highly redundant, highly consistent, and hard to interact with deck that all those pieces are there to make it successful, like you said.
Yeah, and now they get to do wild things like play Valakut with no mountains in their deck.
Right?
Thanks to Dryad of the Elysian Grove. And occasionally, you know, they'll run Dryad and Azusa so that they have a kind of like half an Azusa and a Prismatic Omen plus the real Azusa so that they can play their extra lands. And it's just got a lot of tools right now. And so I think as a result, you know, I'm not really thinking about picking up this deck because I am very far away from it in my paper collection. The other thing is that, you know, it's running Oro occasionally, I guess, for value and things like that. It's just not a deck I'm going to get close to, so I'm going to make sure I have all my tools that I can possibly get that fight this deck.
It amazes me just how powerful Primeval Titan is. You know, it's the heart of all these decks. Without Primeval Titan, I don't think they would function, or they would look very, very different at the very least. And it just kind of makes me wonder, you know, if Blood Moon isn't good enough to deal with these greedy land-based decks, I mean, that seems like a card that's kind of like breaking some of the fundamental rules of Magic.
Titan or Blood Moon?
Titan.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When we interviewed Todd Anderson a couple of weeks ago, he was basically like, what's going to happen? We asked him what he thought was going to happen in Modern. And he was like, can I interest you in a large green man? And, you know, he was right. And I think a lot of people had this call after these cards were banned. And maybe this is a better kind of state for us to be in as far as that goes. But it's still kind of like, it's a lot at the top of the metagame right now. So you want to talk about Blood Moon for a second? Because I do have one deck here that runs it out of the board.
Oh?
I love Blood Moon.
The next deck on the list, of course, that we talked about a couple of times is... I'm happy to tell you, Stan, we talked about it earlier, that Mono Red Prowess is back.
Remember when Faithless Looting got banned and, you know, people were testing various shells for Mono Red Prowess, and I was like, this deck stinks. I feel like I can't win with it anymore. It took a huge gut punch. A few months later, I sleeved it up again, took it to the LGS a few more times, and I gotta say, I did quite a bit better with it.
Did you really?
Yeah.
What do you think is different about it now? Because it's the same deck that was around after Faithless was banned, and I had struggles with that deck as well. I mean, I tried the Kiln Fiend version, I tried the Runaway Steamkin version, I tried the neither one of those versions, and I don't know quite what's going on right now that's making it a lot better.
So, in my experience in the past, some of the more problematic cards for me at the time were Weather the Storm and the Thopter Foundry compo, as like these just very popular tools that people were using to gain life, in addition to whatever other incidental life gain was out there. So it became really hard for me to close the game in the end. And I think we're starting to see Thopter Foundry combo decline and Weather the Storm become less relevant as well.
So it's funny you mentioned that. I think we're going to talk a little bit later about where Urza is right now, because Thopter is actually on the way up in Urza decks as they are on the way down as part of the meta share overall.
Yeah, I'm looking at these lists, though, like you said, Dave, like these are essentially the same sort of prowess lists we've seen in the past. I think Steamkin now seems to be a standard inclusion.
It's really controversial still. Like, some people still hate that card. Like Ryan Overturf, who plays tons and tons of prowess online yet, is running Mishra's Bauble in his version, you know, and it has like some real spicy stuff going on in there.
But like, this is a world where Jund is in the top let's say, quartile of decks that are showing up in these events, isn't Jund going to eat this kind of deck alive, removing the important creatures and just leaving them with a handful of burn?
I mean, maybe that's why Jund is partially on the rise, right? Is that this deck is there for it to prey on a little bit? Because I definitely think Jund struggles a bit with, I mean, in my opinion, Jund would struggle a little bit with Titan. Now, I'm not an expert in either one of those decks, but it feels like, you can have removal to kill the Titan, but you're not always going to be able to out two for one them when they're just like dropping, they're Valakuting you to death or making a bunch of zombies, basically. So,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, Dave, your point about Urza, I think, is interesting. Surely you'll agree that the position of Urza now, especially post Oko, definitely post Mox Opal.
Yep.
I mean, it's clearly like Urza's on an increase post that moment, but that was a huge hit to that.
Absolutely.
I think having like this tier 1 deck that had this life gain engine as part of its plan, essentially being more or less erased from the top meta, I think that helped a deck like Mono Red, pop up.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that helps a lot, I think we should talk about Urza right now, but the last thing I wanted to say about Mono Red, and this is kind of how we got here, is that if Titan's at the top of the meta game and you have a fast deck that has Blood Moons in it, that seems like a good thing that you can cause some trouble for Titan with. And so I think that might be part of the reason that Mono Red Prowess is starting to get good too. The only problem with Prowess is that literally the only way that it can get around an actual Titan is by making your Prowess creatures so big that they can still attack into it. Because there's no other way to kill one.
Well, you don't kill it, then you just, at that point, you burn them out. Because if they're casting Titan on turn 4 at the absolute earliest,
right? In
theory, by that point, you've done at least 10 damage.
Hopefully. Yeah, hopefully. You can't just get into those weird games where you're like, wow, I'm a little bit slow here. How am I going to get through a Titan? Well, I just have to unload my hand and attack with 2, 7, 8 Swift Spears, which is totally possible and has certainly happened before.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about Urza. It's definitely fallen down. It was kind of undisputed the number 1 deck before the bans happened, and now it's ranked right around 10th overall in deck count across both types of events. And what kind of deck is it right now? Well, it looks like most people have moved off of Simic and back onto Grixis, which is sort of where Urza's story started in the first place. Before Oko, before people realized like there was a way to build it that was just green. It's also moved back towards using the Thopter Sword combo.
Yeah, the Thopter Sword combo didn't need Mox Opal. It just made the deck faster.
Yeah, exactly.
Although I guess in theory you did have another artifact that you got to, sacrifice to Thopter Foundry, but that can be replaced.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's still a lot of potential in the card, and people are still just trying to figure out what to do with it. The one thing I would say is that I think it's worth noting that in the challenges and the prelims, Urza had 2 5-0s. Urza archetypes had 2 5-0s in the prelims and had 3 6-1s in the challenges. And so my money is a little bit that maybe this deck is going to re-rise after it continues to be tuned and maybe really how to find its kind of place in the metagame again. So I wouldn't bail on this deck quite yet. I would be keeping an eye for it to come back towards the top of the metagame again, because it looks like sometimes it still is performing really well.
Yeah, Urza is just still a fantastic card that lets you do so many things in your turn. Mox Sapphires are good. I'm tired of telling you this.
Yeah. And it still gets to run a Mox. It still gets to run Mox Amber. So if you make a build around enabling that, there's still ways to make it work. I saw somebody tweeting today about playing with a deck that was Underworld Breach grinding station combo with Moxes and Thassa's Oracle and Urza and all this other stuff that was just kind of like, it's almost similar to like, it wasn't Lotus kind of Storm, but it was an Underworld Breach deck in Modern that was using Urza and Breach to be able to kind of just abuse a graveyard similar to those Lotus decks in Pioneer. Maybe that's the next direction it goes. It's hard to say.
Let's talk about the other Urza, the Architect. He built a tower, he built a mine, and then he rested.
That's right. So the next kind of archetype, super archetype down is kind of Tron decks, right? And that's led right now by Eldrazi Tron, because Urza's Tower and green are apparently no longer friends.
This is a sad thing. This is a sad thing for me to realize. I was hoping that I could maybe go back to my pile of Russian Tron cards, have some fun with it, but it doesn't seem like it's doing too well.
Unfortunately, I think you need to get some chalices if you want to play, my dude.
Ugh, Russian chalices? That seems a little pricey.
It does seem a little pricey.
Tell me why it's not so good.
Well, I'm not sure why it isn't so good right now necessarily, but I can say that Green Tron is just not being played, and that the new kind of old version, the core tapper deck that's called Dice Factory, that is really obnoxious to play against as well, especially if you're someone like me who really hates Urza's Tower as a card and a concept.
On the conceptual level, I hate your architecture.
I don't like that you get a bunch of soul lands. What else can I say? This new version actually did more stuff, appeared more times than the Green Tron deck, and racked up a bunch of wins in the prelim. It had 22 wins in the prelims, and it was in the same bracket as Burn and Titan Shift and Storm as far as like the raw number of wins. So when you kind of put them all together, you get an archetype that's still happening. And Eldrazi Tron in particular was actively hit by the bans when they banned Microsoft Lattice, and it's still performing all right.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed, especially after the fact, Microsoft Lattice, my favorite card and operating system, it only was one slot in the sideboard. You only ever played one. And with the rise of these Titan decks, I think it's been replaced by Sundering Titan. And now you just have this new great silver bullet against the top dog in the meta that is also a win condition.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when that ban happened, there was a lot of discussion about if e-tron could survive without the ability to do the auto win button. And to me, it feels a little bit like it hasn't really missed a beat. You know, good players are still on it. At least they were at different points in the last month in the challenges. It has 1-7-0 finish and 1 win in the challenges among performance in the prelims that was in the top tier as well. So it just seems to me like, hey, still very good. I think that if you, and it's even still playing Karn the Great Creator as a package. It's not like they found a different thing to do with their sideboard and their main board kind of for value.
Yeah, because liquid metal coating was also fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, Lattice wasn't the only good thing about this deck. And I think as long as Reality Smasher and Thought Nazi are around, and there's a deck that could ramp into those with some consistency, is and play Chalice of the Void, and heck, why not Emrakul the Promised End that you can actually cast and get that cast trigger? I'm actually not surprised this deck is still around. I think it's going to be really good for a while.
Makes sense to me.
And Shane, the reason why Mono Green Tron might not be as present right now, I think that has to do with the presence of Mono Red Prowess as just like potentially a faster burn deck.
Sure, never helps.
And I think these Titan decks can juke it, right? You can either, if the Tron player has a Karn, then you can play a bunch of zombies. And if the Tron player has an Ugin that's, low enough, then you play your Primeval Titan that brings in more Titans.
Yeah, I'm curious how that matchup plays out. I haven't played that in a minute. So, I'm looking at the list and I'm seeing that, Tron isn't off the face of the earth, but it's not anywhere near as popular and as prevalent as it once was.
As it once was even like 8 months ago or 6 months ago.
Exactly.
Question. Mid-range. Dead or alive?
Apparently it's quite alive. My pins. They're no longer valid.
We ran out of those a long, long time ago, man. So Jund was the deck that actually appeared the most in these top 32s, rather inexplicably. So within the Modern Challenge, we actually saw 12 copies across the top 32s. And Dave has no idea why.
Does anybody have any idea why? It's pretty interesting. And they're very stock lists too. Like it didn't feel like there were any new cards in any of them or any like new tech that suddenly enabled them to come back.
Because Oko was a nightmare for it. And that's basically probably it. People love Jund. And now that Oko's gone, it doesn't hose their entire strategy.
I also think maybe Liliana the Veil is really good right now.
For the Edict?
yes, for the Edict, because people are playing kind of narrow creature strategies, as well as the consistent hand disruption, so you can potentially run a card or a deck like Titan out of gas. I think that's pretty good. And Goyf is just like a 2-mana beater that gets the job done. And part of me suspects it's really those two cards that are keeping Jund so strong. And then the rest of the package, you can tune to your meta.
Yeah, it's funny when you look at like what are the fatal push decks in the format, like what's picking off opposing Tarmogoyfs or on the other side of the battlefield. You basically have the Mirror and Death Shadow.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and speaking of, Death Shadow seems like maybe it's having a more middling kind of performance at least in the tournaments that we're looking at here, which is sad because I put a lot of time into playing Death Shadow recently, and it's the other Tarmogoyf deck basically, right? So I feel a little bit like maybe some of the people who were playing Goyfs in Death Shadow might have gone, I need better spells, I need more 2-for-1s, I need to go more mid-range, and maybe came home to Jund. And so that's what's making me wonder if Jund is there. And part of that, again, might be because of the kind of presence of not burn, but mono red prowess.
Yeah, especially if we stick to our theory that Jund beats up on a deck like this, which supports some of my experience with mono red prowess, then I think maybe it has, some decent matchups in the meta that it gets to prey on.
I mean, there's always the balance, right? Where it's like Jund can take a lot of damage from its mana base. If Jund going down to 15 off of a fetch shock Thoughtseize is never going to be good for it. There is the Blood Moon issue in the sideboard for mono red blitz. Jund is going to know about that, of course, and can try to play around it, but you can't always. You don't always get your fetches to shock to get your basics. You sometimes have a couple of shock lands in your hand, and you're like, well, maybe they won't have it. I can't really mold a 5 to try to get perfect basic mana.
I have seen a couple of Jund lists that are running Arkham's Astrolabe.
Oh my goodness.
What?
And playing Blood Moon themselves. By the way, I don't think they appeared in any of these prelim or challenge results, but I've seen it floating around a little bit, which just seems like some wild tech to bring into Jund. Yeah, but unfortunately, to pop back over to Shadow for a second, it was top 5 for wins in the challenge. It was barely top 10 in the prelims. They had only one 5-0 in a prelim for a Shadow deck and no 7-0s or 6-1s in any of the challenges. It just kind of seems like maybe it's time to try something else for a minute. Bonus episode that came out early this week you should check out, notwithstanding, where we go deep on Shadow. I might use this as part of an excuse to kind of hop off of Shadow and go play some Prowess again, but let's see.
Yeah, unlike Jund, if I'm playing Shadow and my opponent is on burn, that just puts so much pressure on me to make absolutely no mistakes and draw very well.
Yeah, it depends a little bit on which deck you're playing. Because post board, you have a chance to have a bunch of Cobrew come in and help you out a lot. If you are on Jund or a 4-color Shadow, you get a chance to play Tarmogoyf instead of Gurmag Angler. So if they bring in some kind of like graveyard hate to keep you from gangling, you're a little bit more vulnerable, I think, with Grixis Death Shadow than on the 4-color list, essentially. And so I found that my matchup on 4-color against red was like fine, but not great. But Grixis Death Shadow, I feel like, is a lot harder to kind of navigate that.
All right, let's take a second to talk about a deck after my own heart.
Mm-hmm.
Blue-red control.
Yeah, this is a secret thing that I saw in the lists, I think.
Just being plugged into that community a little bit, a lot of people are playing the Blue-red Breach with Emrakul and Through the Breach, even Aspiring Spike, friend of the show, and Shane's buddy.
Oh yeah, by the way, I forgot to mention that I was able to meet up with Aspiring Spike. I was able to meet up with Yama Killer, Gull, and Everett, 2 streamers that we've had on the show before. They were cool to hang out with. So yeah, props to them as well for being chill guys.
Very cool.
Yeah. So, when Aspiring Spike starts playing Through the Breach, in addition to like all the usual blue-red control players, I think that speaks a little bit to the deck's positioning right now. And maybe it's just a better controlled shell in this moment than blue-white control because Wraths aren't as good. Because I think that's why you play blue-white over anything else.
Totally. And it's interesting because the counts of decks that we saw played and performing at our kind of like various performance thresholds that we had for decks, blue-red was pretty much the same count as blue-white control. And I feel like I haven't seen that in a while. That was a pretty big surprise to me.
Yeah, these blue-red decks aren't even playing Thing in the Ice as often as they used to. Through the Breach just seems like such a popular finisher for these strategies. And I think the fact that Thing in the Ice isn't seeing play kind of adds a little credence to my theory that Wraths just aren't as powerful in this meta as they were, a few months ago even.
Totally. You're not wrathing anybody's Primeval Titan away before they get value. You know?
It's those zombie tokens that make me think that I want to bring in Anger of the Gods whenever I have this matchup. Because you gotta play that Anger. Because sometimes those zombies, they get in the way.
Awesome. So that's what we have kind of like looking at the major archetypes as far as what we saw. But there were a couple of final like quick hits that we saw within the data that we thought were interesting. Just bring up to everybody. Already talked about this, but the group that we labeled as combo Storm, Ad Nauseam, Neobrand, Random Broken Stuff seems to be good at the moment. It's second in wins and challenges and fifth in wins and prelims. So if you would like to not interact, this is your time.
That being said, with regard to combo, Heliod and Druid combo haven't really shown up as much as they had been, during the Oko period.
This is really surprising me because I know that the Lotus Box crew has been heavily on this. Zan Syed has been streaming it. Zan and Collins were getting those decks together to play at a recent SCG. Chris Castor-Rappel, another host with Collins on Grindcast, he just, I think he placed 5th place in the Modern Classic at SCG Philly with the Heliod combo. So it's doing things, but I don't think that people are rushing to it yet. And I'm kind of interested why, and hoping that that's something that I'm going to be testing soon just for fun. And so I hope that I can see how it feels compared to the old Devoted Druid deck that I had played a decent amount before.
I mean, testing it soon for fun and also potentially for an upcoming episode of the show, right?
Well, I don't like to spoil things, Dave.
I like to tease. Got to keep the fans excited.
Shane, as a former Druid player, I would think that mid-range is a huge problem for that deck, as you have both hand disruption and removal for, your creature combo pieces on the board.
But there's so many pieces to it now. Do you know what I mean? You have your classic Devoted Vizier combo. You have Heliod, which is indestructible. You have Kitchen Finks, which survives removal. You have Ranger Captain to tutor up those pieces. You have Spike Feeder to gain infinite life. You have Finale of Devastation, Once Upon a Time, Collected Company. You have all these ways to counteract the 1-for-1 removal that a lot of the point removal decks are offering, that I have to imagine that this kind of strategy is frustrating to face down now. Especially because stuff like Jund isn't always presenting the biggest clock. And if you're like blocking with the Kitchen Finks and it persisting and things like that, it's just like, it's got to be really frustrating.
Well,
because you get so much time to set things up in my theory space here.
Shane says if mid-range isn't dead, Heliod will strike it down.
Yeah, I happened to get 2 Heliods at the GP. I can't wait to finish off this collection so I can never play this deck in paper.
Attaboy.
Perfect.
You guys want to talk about Dredge for a second?
Oh man, let me talk about Dredge. Let me.
Another deck that Shane used to play.
So, the Ox rules. Okay, the Ox is the truth. It's super cool. It works incredibly well. It allows the deck to do really weird things, like even run Blood Moon effects in the sideboard if it wants to. So it's like, hey, all I need eventually is 2 red mana, and I'm going to take over the board. I'm going to turn off your ability to win by maintaining my own. And so that's a pretty cool tech that the deck can do now. It doesn't need that Life from the Loam endgame. It just needs an Ox endgame. It's also still super fast. Losing looting does stink. I did a lot of gold fishing and just messing around with it this weekend. And yeah, you have a narrower range of keepable hands, which does stink. But that's just a necessary consequence of the deck like this, is because it can't be too good. And I think it still has, as we see from the results, it's still putting up pretty darn good numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in that bubble zone for us where it's kind of like right on the edge of frequency and win number in our results. So I think it's a deck to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it's one of those things too where it's not quite tier 1, so people aren't always having those 3 cages or the ley line of the voids always, so you can kind of dodge an incredible amount of hate that might have been there in a larger graveyard meta.
Cool. Last couple of decks we want to talk about.
Vile Aggro. Y'all remember humans, also known as people?
I still love you, humans. Still fun to play.
Seems like this deck is trending down right now, though, and this deck and Spirits both, even if you look at them as one group together, really kind of came in pretty low on the list of our assessments. They were right around 10th in frequency in both the prelim and the challenges, and so even together, the two decks weren't really doing that much. I'm not sure why that is right now.
Hate to see it. I mean, formerly humans could do something like name Primeval Titan and get a lot of equity off that. But now that deck has different angles to win. And so something like if Titan's doing well and isn't reliant entirely just on Titan to win the game, then that's always pretty decent.
That's an interesting point, because if they name Primeval Titan with their Meddling Mage, getting the Field of the Dead online becomes a much slower proposition.
Yet it is still one.
Yeah.
Makes you think. Part of me thinks that this might be a matter of like Titan kind of sets the precedent for the meta at the very, very top. And then everything else is sort of like a waterfall of responses to that. And something that we're not seeing a lot of is GDS and Storm. Perhaps because of how they, match up against the other top tier of the meta. And GDS and Storm, to me, have always been humans' favorite decks to play against. And without those two being as present, maybe humans doesn't have as many free wins as it needs to be successful in Modern.
Yeah. It's too bad, though. If you are a Spirits player, maybe it's time to check out Pioneer. May I interest you in Pioneer?
I mean, I think humans still is a deck you can take to your LGS and totally have fun with. It still has a good power level. It's still lots of fun, but it might not be the thing you take to the highest DV event.
Yeah. Or if you do, you should have a really great plan against Primeval Titan and Field of the Dead. Last deck that I'd like to call out. Y'all remember Niv Mizzet?
Yeah.
Not so good anymore.
Literally 0 results for it within the constraints of these events from what we could tell. I mean, we're talking about like 600 decks or something like this in this sample size that we looked at. So there might be one that we missed, but there's nothing here.
Cave Dan, if you hear this, please tweet what happened to Niv.
Yeah, I don't know. People are playing Jund now instead.
Part of me suspects that it probably comes down to just like the types of tools that Niv has access to, which are a bunch of gold cards, might not line up particularly well with the type of things that Mono Red Prowess, Midrange, and Titan are doing. Because it is a control deck. So if your control pieces don't answer the format well enough, then your control deck isn't very well positioned. So although I can't actually identify the specific cards and the specific interactions, because I have literally no experience with Niv, I have to suspect that that's probably what's going on.
Are there any surprises for you all on things that are also kind of underperforming right now? For me, I have to say the Golgari Yawgmoth deck not kind of taking off is a little bit of a surprise. It seemed like people were talking about how potent it was, and then it had the breakout tournament in Aaron Barich's hands, and it doesn't really seem like it's popped off.
Well, this sample goes back to January 18th, and so there's a couple weeks in here that I think were before people really knew about that deck existing, or at least 1 week, maybe. But yeah, I think that's more of a factor of people not picking it up than anything else. Personally, is my gut there. I think Burn is just not keeping up with Prowess, really.
Yeah, so that's what Burn's just not there because Prowess is just better.
Well, yeah, and the thing that's really interesting is that if you look at the challenges, there were a couple of Burn decks that did pretty well in the first challenge after the ban in January, and then after that, it's just gone again. And I don't know if that's because people realized that Titan really was going to establish itself at the top of the metagame. And so we're not going to do burn against it because Prowess is faster or kind of what. But that's kind of what happened to burn, at least in the challenges. And then in the prelims, there's basically 7 burn decks within the results that we have. And, that's the same amount as Blue-White Control, Grixis Death Shadow, and regular Tron. And so, it's there, but it just doesn't seem to be kind of like standing out in the win column as much as some of the other decks are.
You know what I think it is? The creatures in Mono Red Prowess are bigger, and they get bigger because you're executing your game plan, i.e. triggering Prowess.
Mm-hmm.
And also, in my experience, Mono Red Prowess beats up on burn because Prowess can play Dragon's Claw, and then you just start gaining so much life that burn never recovers, while your big beefy Swift Spears just beat face, or eventually you recharge your hand with Bedlam Reveler that's also, bigger than anything burn can deal with.
Makes sense.
It's easy math, really.
It's just math, you guys. All right, so real quick, as we get out of here, what are the final takeaways that each one of that you guys have from this kind of discussion that we just had about what Modern is? What are you going to do now? Is it going to change what your tendencies are? What are you thinking about now the next time you go to play Modern? Stan.
Well,
maybe I'll start with you.
I love playing at the LGS. I love Dice Dojo. Good games. Some other shops in and around Chicago. This stuff doesn't impact me very, very much, to be honest. Like, I'm still going to either play a blue-red deck or a mono-red deck, or if I'm, like, feeling really something else, then, like, I'll whip out Stoneforge or Death Shadow. But in general, I'm trying to be more of that person who plays the one deck, so all I can do from this is look at how people are building blue-red and maybe mono-red and just try to adapt that to my local shop.
Do any of these decks that we feel like are getting more frequent in the online meta, are they appearing more often at the card shop, you think? Like Titan, do you think that frequency's changed at all?
I do see Titan. I mean, one of the cool things about Chicago, I think, even though it's a diverse meta in the stores I play, and you're unlikely to have like the same matchup multiple times, whatever's at the top of the tier, it's pretty likely that at least one person in the room will have that. So I have to have a plan for Titan. And I definitely have to have a plan for Jund, because half of Chicago has the Jund deck. So in that regard, this data and what's happening on the larger competitive scales of Modern does trickle down and inform local players, especially in a community as big as Chicago's. But, let's say I was someone who only had Bant Soul Herder or, some other kind of fringy deck. I don't think this data is discouraging per se. I think it just kind of tells you how you need to work your strategies and sideboards to kind of beat the top of the meta while still honing your own skills. And there's nothing really new emerging here that tickles my fancy.
Here's what I think. I think the Heliod deck is probably a lot better than it looks on Magic Online, because the Spike Feeder combo is essentially impossible to execute. A lot of the combos to do with that deck are really challenging to execute. I think that's why it's slightly more popular in paper than it is online. I think it's going to be a better performer than it seems. It makes me excited to start playing it in paper, especially. I think I also like to attack on the angle of Dredge still. I think Dredge is still really cool. I think the mechanic is fun to mess around with, and it's a powerful deck. And I like the concept of still being able to play a very good red deck, because I think that there are decks that I can squeak out a few wins here and there with. I like playing them. I like executing the game plans that they have, and so having like a tier 1 red deck in the Prowess gives me something to always audible back to for every tournament, because I always do that. I always think about playing something else, and I play a red deck. So if I'm playing something with high EV, playing mono red blitz sounds like fun to me. But largely, I think it seems good. It seems like it's pretty flat. There's different options for different types of players. You can play grindy decks. You can play big mana decks. You can play combo-y decks. You can play Jund removal style decks. You can play your Death Shadow. You can play your control with Snowblade. It seems like it's everywhere, and nothing seems too busted.
You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of when Izzet Phoenix was the number one deck in the format, where you had this like very clear top dog, but the meta beneath it was quite diverse. I think that's what we have right now with Amulet Titan, or rather Primeval Titan decks, where Primeval Titan is this really important creature that informs like, you know, a handful of decks at the top, but beneath that, you can play a lot of different strategies, and it doesn't feel like as homogenized of a meta as we had during Hogak, or as we had during what was that Soul-type Planeswalker? Already forgot his name.
Oko.
The sexy one? Yeah, Oko.
Oko.
You know, I never remember an X after I ditch him.
Well, for my part, I think I kind of tipped my hand towards this a little bit earlier, but I really want to make sure I have a plan against Titan for any deck that I'm playing, and so I think that I'm gonna stick to the two decks that I've been playing the most, which is mono red Prowess and 4-color Shadow. And I'm just going to make sure I have a really solid plan against Titan, not a Shadow, because one of the good things about that deck is that you can do a lot of sideboarding. So you can get Ashiok, you can have Aether Gust, which is secretly, I guess, a really good card against Primeval Titan because of the wording on the card and a couple other things.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I'm gonna try Mono Red Prowess because I get to do some blood mooning again and just kind of see where it goes from there.
Yeah, I do think it's cool when the potentially fastest deck in the format is one I own, and that way, if I want to just like make my life easier when I go to the store, if I want to play fast games instead of slow, grindy control matchups, at least I know I can fall back on this Mono Red Prowess deck, and I'll know how to play it. I won't hate playing it, and if nothing else, my matches will last for 20 minutes. So there you have it, folks. The state of the meta in February of 2020. It's fun to look at these moments because I bet you in 6 months' time, if after a set has been released or, maybe something has been removed from the format, who knows, the meta is going to be pretty different. And I love looking at these particular moments in time and trying to learn about them and look back on them and what we learned in that process, because I think when you stick with a format like Modern that has so many staples that remain good for such long periods of time, it helps you grow as a player because you're more informed and you get to hold on to those lessons longer than, say, if you were a standard player. So it's kind of cool to analyze them and see what changes when it does.
Yeah, it's nice that it's a dynamic game. It's one that's constantly changing. It's one of the appeals to it. It's a constant puzzle to solve, right?
But enough about Modern. That wraps up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. If you'd like to submit a question to our podcast, pick our brain on something in Modern or Pioneer, heck, even suggest a future topic for an episode, you can tweet us at thedivedown, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show directly, you can join our Patreon, where joining at any tier gets you access to our super secret Slack channel. You can chat with us while we're busy at work or looking busy. Also, shout out to manatraders.com for sponsoring The Dive Down. If you sign up for Mana Traders using promo code THEDIVEDOWN, all one word, you'll get 15% off your first 3 months of renting Magic Online cards. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and play more Modern!